Recently, I discussed the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, with you. And in one of those episodes, I talked about the Bhagavad Gita. And in one of the earlier podcasts, also, I had discussed the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. It's really, in some ways, the central philosophy of the present day Hinduism as it is practiced today. And therefore, I thought we should also separately talk about the Gita in general, because it's not just the Bhagavad Gita. There's not just one Gita. There are many. And as it happens in the pluralism of Hinduism, you'll find multiple school of thoughts, multiple gods and goddesses, and similarly, multiple Gitas. And that's why I picked this book called My Gita by Devdutt Pattanaik. And in that book, I found quite interesting things about the history of Gita and the different Gitas that are there. So, based on this book, I'm going to discuss all these aspects of the Gita. So, the Bhagavad Gita is the song of the divine, as we all know. But before that, there have been many more Gitas. One of them is called Vyada Gita, or the Butcher's Song. So you see, there's quite a range of philosophies that we are going to find in it. In fact, in Mahabharata itself, there are many Gitas. The Vyada Gita itself, that occurs in Mahabharata before the war happens and before the episode of the Bhagavad Gita takes place. And if we have to grasp the sense of these different ideas, these different Gitas, we'll have to work out the approaches, especially our approach towards Hindu history and how these different texts were written and what was the ideas behind them. So the history of Hinduism, if we talk about that, it spreads at least 5,000 to 7,000 years. And there are different phases that occur. The first is, in some ways, as per the evidence that we have, evidence of the written documents, as per the archaeological evidence. The first phase that we get is the Indus Valley phase. Then comes the Vedic phase, then the Upanishadic phase, then you get the Buddhist phase, then the Puranic phase, and then we get to the medieval times and the Bhakti phase, and then the Orientalist phase, and finally we get here in the modern phase. Although there is a lot of evidence, especially in recent times, that we have got from the Indus and Saraswati Valley civilizations, but most of the things that we have about the past of Hinduism, they remain speculative, and there is still not consensus. But we can talk about things where there is some consensus. When we talk about the earlier phases of Hinduism, especially around the time of Vedic Hinduism, there were no temples. And the idea of God, as you find in different Vedas, that was rather abstract. But towards the end of these phases, the final 4 phases, you find there's a difference. You see the rise of temples, you see the belief in personal God, whether it's Shiva or one of his sons like Ganesha, or Vishnu or one of his avatars like Krishna or Rama, or the many goddesses such as Saraswati or Lakshmi. So those of you who don't know about this timeline, generally in today's world, we refer to the Vedic phase around 1500 to 2000 BC, roughly around 4000 years ago, let's say. And then there was the Upanishadic phase when the Upanishads were written, which was just around 3000 years ago. And then came the Buddhist phase. Buddhism as such grew out of Hinduism, discarding the ritualistic aspect of it. And that was around 2500 years ago. Then the Puranic phase, when we find the stories and mythologies of Hinduism coming. That was 2000 years ago. And the Bhakti phase was pretty much in the medieval periods from around 1000 to 800 years ago. And then the Orientalist phase, which was coinciding with India's exposure to the British colonialism. And now we are here, as I said, in the modern phase. And as you know, things never stop evolving, and we are still evolving, and so is the religion around us. And before I proceed any further, I must confess that these timelines that we just discussed, they are not acceptable to all Hindus. There are different schools of thoughts that they think that these ideas much older than the Vedic phase or the Indus Valley phase. But since we haven't got much of the evidence to confirm all those claims, we cannot confirm those things. So let's come back to the point of Gitas and how the reframing of Hinduism it occurred. Around 2000 years ago, South Asia was torn between two extremes. On the one side, there were kings who established great empires like the Nandas, the Mauryas, the Kanvas, the Kushanas, the Guptas. There were different empires that were going on. And on the other side, completely opposite extreme, you'll find the hermits. This long tradition of hermits who would give up on everything that is materialistic in the world, and then they started their own ideas, such as the Mahavira Jain, the Jains, or the Buddhists, the Gautam Buddha. What he did, he left his palaces behind and he pursued this path of a hermit. So these completely two extreme ideas were going on. And at the same time, more and more people, including the kings, as is the story of the Buddha goes, they were choosing the path of hermit over the worldly life, such as that of marriage, family vocation, family responsibilities. And that was causing great alarm. Buddha, he left his kingdom. Same happened with Chandragupta Maurya. He embraced Jainism. His grandson Ashoka, he embraced Buddhism. And this was a radical shift from where the society was coming from. Because prior to this, remember, there was the Vedic age. And then you find there a lot of ritualistic things. The families, the friends, the strangers, the ancestor gods, nature, cosmos. It was all about the household. There were hermits in those times too, the rishis. But they were married and they chose philosophical exploration over material ambitions. At the same time, there were different phases of life in which you pursued these things. At some phase, you pursued your family responsibilities, and at some phase, you relinquished those responsibilities and lived a life of a sannyasi, of a saint, or a hermit. This was because the Vedas presented a world where there was no conflict between the householder's way and the hermit's way. But at that time, these new ideas that were coming of Jainism or Buddhism, they were creating a lot of shift in the way society functioned, the way it thought about the world. So during that period, the reframing of Hinduism, it took place. And it took place rather organically over a period of, let's say, around 1,000 years. There was not really an authority that spearheaded it. It was just these sages. They began communicating Vedic ideas, and they chose stories as their vehicles. And instead of rituals and these processes, they took shelter in these ideas of myths and stories. These stories, they were based on traditional accounts of events, both probably real and sometimes imagined. And these were quite open source, you can say, narratives. There were plots and counterplots, and there were, different kinds of narratives. So these stories began to emerge, and you get Ramayana, you get Mahabharata, and these are also called, by the way, Itihasa. And although it's difficult to translate literally into English, uh, the best we can translate it, it goes something like stories from the past. And they can be true, they may not be true, but what matters is these stories, these narratives, the, the symbolism behind them, that will always be true. They may not be literally true, but metaphorically, they'll always be true. And from here on, we get these two different schools of philosophy. Those who affirmed these stories, they were astikas or theistic philosophy. They were theists. And those who denied these stories, they were the nastikas, the atheistic versions, or you can also say non-believers. So that's where you get these different schools of Jainism, Buddhism, Charvaka. They fall in these non-theistic or atheistic traditions. And there in these stories, you start to find really interesting narratives, literature, poems, and then there are Gitas. If you take the literal meaning of it, of Geet or Gita, it's something like a song. And since you have so many songs, some about one person's life, some about gods, so accordingly you have different Gitas. As I said, in Mahabharata itself there are many Gitas. One of the characters, as you know probably by now, is Bhishma, and he reveals 9 Gitas to Pandavas. There is the prostitute's Gita, the priest's Gita, the farmer's Gita, the ascetic's Gita, the king's Gita, the retired man's Gita, the demon's Gita, the philosopher's Gita, the swan's Gita. And not just in Mahabharata, outside of it too, there are so many Gitas. There are Ashtavakra Gita, Vasishtha Gita, Ram Gita, Shiva Gita, Devi Gita, Ganesha Gita. Of course, there are so many gods and so many songs about them, so you find so many Gitas. But as you know, these days when we talk about the Gita, it almost always means the Bhagavad Gita. It is the most recognized and widely read of the all Gitas. The interesting thing is that at the time when it was written, in its early periods, it wasn't really as popular or as unique a text as it is today. In fact, many of the commentaries, they started appearing when in the medieval times, when different religions such as Christianity and Islam, they entered India. In fact, one of the great coincidences is that one of the world's oldest mosques was built on the Malabar coast in the southern India. It was built in the 7th century. And Adi Shankara, who wrote the first elaborate commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and he is probably the most respected scholar in the Hindu history today. He was also born in the Malabar region in the 8th century. So whether it was a coincidence or this relationship had something more to it, we don't know. But of course, what we do know is that the commentaries, these writings, they started appearing much later than the original texts when they were written. It can also be interpreted in some ways that as societies kept evolving, for example, we saw how Jainism came up, how Buddhism came up. And similarly, when Indians or the Hindus, they got exposed to different mythologies of the world. Their own interpretation of their own texts also varied over the periods of time. So these commentaries, they also occurred in different waves or in different phases. If we talk about the very first commentaries, they were written in Sanskrit and they were written by Vedanta scholars. And one of them, as I mentioned, was probably the most famous one, Adi Shankara. And he was followed by Ramanuja. He was also from southern India, the Tamil Nadu state. And then there was another one from southern India, Madhava Acharya. These earlier scholars, they were concerned about the nature of God and the relationship of divinity and humanity. Was God within or outside? Was God embodied or formless? Their language was quite intellectual and highly poetical. And what is significant is that all these three commentators that I mentioned, they were celibate monks who either did not marry or gave up marriage and established Hindu monastic orders, suggesting clearly that Hinduism, it once upon a time, it used to be a householder's way. It ended up mimicking Buddhism way, or it kind of adopted the Buddhism or Jainism, those traditions it kind of adopted in itself. Then we talk about the next phase of retellings, and this happens in the regional languages such as the Marathi, and then it happens in Malayalam, then Telugu or Tamil, even in the far east or the northeast of India, the Assamese. So different phases, parts of the country, it starts taking place. These stories, they travel to different places. They get translated into different versions. And of course, as this happens, the flavor of the story, some characters, certain events, they also change. And even the emotions, they change. How they refer to gods, that also changes. So for example, in one of the versions, Krishna is referred as mother, and some visualize him as a cow. So that's what happens when an idea which has originated probably far back in the past, when it travels to the masses, it takes its own shape. It kind of absorbs all the things that it finds in different cultures. Then we get to the third wave of translations, and it was done by Europeans mostly. And it was done in the English language, but not just English. You find those translations in the French and other European languages as well. So when these Europeans, they came in contact with India through colonialism, they discovered these texts and they started translating these ancient scriptures. And interestingly, because these translators and colonialists, they were coming from a Christian background, and Christianity and Islam were gaining prominence during the medieval and later periods in India. And their interpretation was that something like, so in Christianity they have Bible, in Islam you have the Quran, and similarly it's probably the Hindu Bible. It's the God's directive to Hindus. Whereas in Hindus' consciousness, there was no such thing as the God's directive before that. But you see that impact today, and today's Hindus, they probably look at their Gita in the same way as a Christian would look at his Bible. So that's the impact of different cultures coming together and influencing each other. Then we get to the fourth wave, and these translations, or I should say retranslations, they were done by Indian nationalists. And people from Aurobindo to Gandhi, they all talked about Gita. And many of them interpreted and reinterpreted its message, and then it became quite popular in those times. And once we get to the independent India and more information flow across, takes place across the world, then we see in different parts of the world, people reading these texts and talking about it. So, for example, Oppenheimer famously, or rather infamously, equated the nuclear explosion the first time that they did. They equated it with the Krishna's cosmic form. And similarly, Aldous Huxley, he saw the Gita as part of the perennial philosophy that bound all humanity. So there were different interpretations, and that's still going on. Still, you find different people reading the text, interpreting it in its own way, and then understanding and applying it in their lives. But we, the people of 21st century, we live in unique times. We have access to the history of the Gita, its creation and its transformation over time. And that can be interesting, but at the same time, for believers, it can be quite a shock. When you do get the context of it and how it was written, how it changed, evolved, all that aspect. And that can be a challenge. But at the same time, the beauty of these ancient texts, and particularly this is true for the Gita, is that they stand the test of time. And it's not a bad idea to reinterpret them from time to time, and also go back to their origins and understand the essence that lies behind. When we do that, it's really therapeutic. It's really wonderful. And you enjoy this process. So I hope you'll do that. If you want to see the details of texts and what happens in the Bhagavad Gita, what conversation takes place, what is its core message, all these things I've discussed in some of the previous podcasts, you can check them out. For now, I'll stop myself at the history of the Gitas and the Bhagavad Gita in particular. And I hope you'll continue to read whichever version or whichever form you find it in. And that's really the beauty of plurality.